Close your eyes. This is a story designed to help you sleep. Tonight, you are alone in a cabin deep in the woods. Rain drums on the tin roof above you. A server hums quietly in the corner. On your screen, lines of code scroll past, anonymous, untraceable, irreversible. You run a crypto mixer. No names. No records. Just mathematics and trust. But tonight, a transaction has arrived that shouldn't exist. A wallet address you've seen before. An amount that doesn't match any of your usual clients. You are about to trace a thread that will pull you out of the forest and into a world you built this cabin to escape. But first, let yourself be completely at ease. Breathe in slowly, and out. Let the rhythm of the rain on the roof become the only sound. There is nothing to solve right now. Just let the story unfold, as you drift deeper into rest. The rain had been falling since sunset. Not a storm, not a downpour, just a steady, patient rhythm on the tin roof of the cabin, a sound that had become so familiar over the years that you barely noticed it anymore. It was the background music of your life, the constant companion to your solitude. When you first moved here, the sound had kept you awake at night, the drumming, the dripping, the soft rush of water through the gutters. But now, years later, it had become a kind of silence. The silence of the forest. The silence of a world that had forgotten you, and that you had chosen to forget in return. The forest outside was dark and still, the tall pines swaying gently in the wind, their branches brushing against the roof with a soft, whispery sound that came and went like the breathing of some vast, ancient creature. Through the cabin's single window, you could see nothing but the dark outlines of tree trunks and the occasional glint of moonlight on wet leaves. The forest stretched for miles in every direction, a deep, green wilderness of Douglas fir and western hemlock, of moss-covered logs and hidden streams. There were no neighbors. No roads within 3 miles. No power lines or telephone poles. Just trees, and rain, and the quiet hum of your own thoughts. The cabin was small. One room, really, with a wood stove in the corner that you fed with split logs throughout the night. The stove's iron door was slightly ajar, and the fire inside had burned down to a bed of glowing coals that pulsed with a soft, orange light. The heat it gave off was gentle but persistent, warming the rough wooden walls and the narrow bed pushed against the far corner and the desk that dominated the center of the room. The desk was made from an old door laid across 2 sawhorses, a makeshift arrangement that had become permanent over the years. Its surface was scarred with coffee rings and the faint impressions of pen marks, and it was cluttered with the tools of your trade, a mechanical key, board, a high-resolution monitor, a tangle of cables that snaked across the floor to the server rack in the corner. The walls were lined with bookshelves, most of them sagging under the weight of technical manuals and paperback novels and the accumulated detritus of a life lived alone. There were books on cryptography and network security, their spines cracked from years of reference. There were old science fiction novels, their covers faded and curled. There were notebooks filled with handwritten code, the ink smudged in places where you had erased and rewritten. And there were small, personal objects, a smooth stone you had found in the creek behind the cabin, a pine cone that had fallen on the roof one night and startled you awake, a photograph of a dog you had owned years ago, before you came here. A single lamp burned on the desk, its green glass shade tilted to cast its amber glow across the keyboard. The light pooled on the wooden surface like warm honey, illuminating your hands and the grain of the wood and the faint, almost invisible layer of dust that settled over everything in this cabin no matter how often you cleaned. The only other light in the room came from the computer screen, a pale blue rectangle that cast a cool, electronic glow across your face and the rough wooden beams of the ceiling above you. On the screen, lines of code scrolled past. Your code. You had written it yourself, years ago, sitting at this very desk, in this very cabin, with the same rain drumming on the same tin roof. It had begun as a hobby, an intellectual challenge. Could you build a system that was truly anonymous? Could you create a machine that could take a digital asset, break it into pieces so small they were meaningless, and reassemble them on the other side without leaving a single trace? It had taken you months to get it right. Years to refine it. But now, the code was a beautiful thing. Elegant. Efficient. Untraceable. A crypto mixer. A tumbler. A service that took cryptocurrency from one address, broke it into 1,000 fragments, shuffled those fragments through a labyrinth of intermediate wallets, and reassembled them into clean, anonymous coins at the other end. The mathematics behind it was complex, but the principle was simple: privacy. The right to move money without being watched. The right to be invisible. People paid for this service, and they paid well. They paid in Bitcoin, in Ethereum, in Monero, whatever currency they preferred. The mixer took a small percentage of each transaction as its fee, and over time, those small percentages had accumulated. You were not rich. But you were comfortable. You had enough to keep the generator running, to buy the supplies you needed, to live a life that required very little. You did not ask who your clients were. The T was the point. You did not want to know. You had built this machine to be blind, to be deaf, to be indifferent to the morality of the transactions it processed. It was a tool, and like any tool, it could be used for good or for ill. That was not your concern. Your concern was the code. The code was clean. The code was pure. The code never asked questions. The server hummed quietly in the corner, a low, steady note beneath the drumming of the rain. It was a custom rig, built from parts you had ordered online and shipped to a P.O. box in the nearest town, 40 miles away. You had assembled it yourself on the cabin's rough wooden floor, screwing the motherboards into their racks, connecting the cooling fans, running the cables that now snaked across the room. It ran on a generator out back, a sturdy diesel machine that you had hauled up the mountain on a trailer behind your old truck. The generator needed fuel every few days, which meant driving into town with jerry cans, filling them at the gas station, and hauling them back along the winding forest roads. It was not a convenient life. But it was yours. You had chosen it. You had chosen the silence and the solitude and the rain. The server's lights blinked in the darkness, tiny green and blue LEDs that indicated network activity, disk usage, processor load. They flickered in patterns that you had learned to read over the years, a silent language that told you the machine was healthy, that the code was running, that everything was as it should be. You were about to close the interface for the night when something caught your eye. A new transaction had appeared in the queue. It had arrived just moments ago, and the mixer was already processing it, breaking it into fragments, routing it through the first layer of intermediate wallets. This was normal. This happened dozens of times a day. But there was something different about this transaction. Something that made you lean closer to the screen, your fingers pausing on the keyboard. The amount was large, much larger than the usual transactions. Your typical client sent a few Bitcoin, sometimes a dozen, rarely more. This transaction was for 1.618 Bitcoin. The number caught your attention immediately. It was not random. It was the golden ratio, phi, the mathematical constant that appeared in everything from the spirals of galaxy s to the proportions of ancient Greek temples. It was also, and this was the part that made your breath catch in your throat, the constant you had used in an old encryption protocol. A protocol you had developed years ago, in another life, with people who were no longer part of your world. The sending address was one you had never seen before. That in itself was not unusual. New clients appeared all the time, their wallets fresh and anonymous. But the memo field was not empty. Most clients left it blank. Some filled it with a random string of characters, a meaningless hash generated by their wallet software. This memo field contained a sentence. A complete sentence, written in plain English, in the same monospaced font as the code on your screen. I still remember you. I know where you are. You stared at the words. The rain drummed on the roof above you. The server hummed in the corner. The fire in the wood stove crackled softly as a log shifted and settled. The cursor blinked steadily at the end of the line, a small, patient pulse that seemed to be waiting for you to do something. You had built this machine to be invisible. You had built this life to be hidden. But someone, somewhere in the vast, anonymous dark of the blockchain, had just proven that they could see through both. And they were looking directly at you. The words on the screen did not change. You stared at them for a long moment, the rain drumming on the tin roof above you, the server humming its quiet, steady note in the corner. The fire in the wood stove had burned down to embers, and the cabin was growing cold, but you did not move. I still remember you. I know where you are. 12 words, typed into the memo field of a Bitcoin transaction, addressed to no one and everyone. But they were meant for you. Someone had found you. Someone had reached through the layers of encryption and anonymity that you had spent years constructing, the firewalls, the VPNs, the cryptographic protocols, and touched the one thing you had believed was untouchable. You pushed back from the desk and stood. The chair scraped against the rough wooden floor, a sound that seemed too loud in the small cabin, too sudden, too human. You walked to the window and looked out into the dark. The rain was still falling, steady and patient, streaking the glass with silver. The forest was a wall of shadows beyond the glass, the tall pines swaying in the wind, their branches tracing slow, dark arcs against the sky. There was no one out there. There had never been anyone out there. That was why you had chosen this place. That was why you had built your life here, in the quiet, in the solitude, where the world could not reach you. Where you could be invisible. But someone had reached you. Someone had found a way through. You turned back to the screen. The transaction was still there, sitting in the queue, waiting to be processed. The mixer had already begun its work. The 1.618 Bitcoin had been broken into fragments, each fragment routed to a different intermediate wallet, each wallet preparing to pass its fragment on to the next in a chain that would eventually reassemble into clean, untraceable coins at the other end. The process was automatic. It required no intervention from you. It had been running this way for 3 years, flawless, silent, invisible. You watched the fragments scatter across the network like a handful of thrown sand, each grain finding its own path through the labyrinth you had built. That was the thing about the mixer. It never slept. It never made mistakes. It never asked questions. It simply did what it was built to do, over and over, day after day, night after night, while the rain fell on the roof and the forest grew darker around you and the seasons turned from summer to autumn to winter to spring and back again. It was a perfect machine. You had made it perfect. You had spent countless hours at this very desk, writing and rewriting the code, testing it against every attack vector you could imagine, patching every vulnerability, closing every door. And now, somehow, someone had found a crack you had not known was there. Or perhaps, and this thought was more unsettling, someone had been given a key. You sat down again. Your fingers found the keyboard, settling into their familiar position on the worn keycaps. You did not know what you were looking for, but you knew you had to look. The sending address. You had seen it for only a moment before the mixer had begun its work, but it was still there in the log file, recorded in the precise, unfeeling language of the blockchain. You pulled it up on the screen. A long string of alphanumeric characters, random, meaningless, anonymous. Just another address among the millions that populated the blockchain, indistinguishable from any other. But addresses on the blockchain are not truly anonymous. They are pseudonymous. They leave traces. They have histories. They can be followed, if you know how to look. And you knew how to look. You traced the address back through the blockchain, following its history from transaction to transaction. The blockchain is a public ledger, after all, a record of every transaction ever made, inscribed in code and replicated across thousands of computers around the world. It does not forget. It does not forgive. And it does not hide. Most of the address's activity was recent, a few small payments here and there, the kind of thing you might expect from any ordinary wallet. A payment to an online service. A transfer to an exchange. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested the owner of this address was anything other than an ordinary user of cryptocurrency. But then, as you scrolled further back, past the recent transactions and into the deeper history of the address, you found something that made your fingers stop on the keyboard. The log entry was dated 2 years ago, almost to the day. A single transaction. A small amount of Bitcoin, just a fraction of a coin, worth almost nothing at the time. It had been sent from this same address to another address. And the receiving address was one you recognized immediately. It was your own. Not the mixer's operational wallet. Not the anonymous address you used to collect fees from clients. Not any of the intermediate wallets that the mixer used to shuffle funds. Your personal wallet. The one you had set up when you first built the mixer. The one you had used to test the code, sending tiny amounts of Bitcoin back and forth to make sure the algorithm was working correctly. You had abandoned that wallet long ago, migrated to a new one, left the old address to gather dust in the blockchain's infinite ledger. But someone had kept it. Someone had saved it. And someone had just used it to send you a message. You leaned back in your chair. The rain continued its steady drumming on the roof, a sound that had once been comforting and now felt like the ticking of a clock. The server hummed in the corner, its lights blinking in their familiar patterns. The fire in the wood stove was almost out, the last embers pulsing with a faint orange glow. You pulled your sweater tighter around your shoulders, though the cold you felt was not the kind that could be cured by warmth. This address, the address that had just sent you a message saying "I know where you are," had been used to send you a test transaction 2 years ago. And the only person who had access to that address at that time was you. Unless you had shared it. And you had shared it. With one person. The person who had helped you build the mixer in the first place. The person who had sat beside you at this very desk, writing code into the early hours of the morning, fueled by coffee and conviction. The person who had believed, even more than you did, that cryptocurrency could change the world. The person who had left one night and never come back. Your partner. Someone was using your own old wallet to send you a message. And the message was not just a statement. It was a key. The 1.618 Bitcoin. The golden ratio. The mathematical constant that appeared in the spirals of seashells and the proportions of ancient temples and the structure of galaxies. It was the constant you had used in an old encryption protocol, a protocol you had built together, years ago, in the early days of your partnership. A protocol that only 2 people in the world knew how to decode. And now, somehow, your partner, the man who had vanished without a trace 3 years ago, was reaching out to you through the very machine you had built together. He was alive. He was out there. And he was trying to tell you something. The question was, what? And why now? And what had kept him away for so long? You stared at the screen, the cursor blinking steadily at the end of the line. The mixer continued its work, oblivious to the questions that were swirling in your mind. It never slept. It never asked. It just kept running, waiting for the next transaction, the next fragment, the next piece of the endless puzzle. And somewhere out there, in the vast, anonymous dark of the blockchain, your partner was waiting for you to find the next piece. The old wallet address glowed on the screen like a ghost. You stared at it for a long time, the rain drumming its patient rhythm on the tin roof above you, the server humming its quiet, steady note in the corner. The fire in the wood stove had gone out entirely now, and the cabin had grown cold, but you barely noticed. All your attention was focused on that single string of alphanumeric characters, a Bitcoin address you had created 3 years ago and abandoned 2 years ago, when you migrated to a new wallet and left the old one to gather dust in the blockchain's infinite ledger. But it had not gathered dust. Someone had used it. Someone had reached into the past and pulled it back into the present. You had confirmed the address's history beyond any doubt. The blockchain was unforgiving in its precision. Every transaction was recorded, every Satoshi accounted for, every movement of every coin traceable from its creation to its current resting place. The old wallet had been dormant for 2 years, exactly 2 years, almost to the day. Its last transaction before tonight had been that small test payment you had made when you were first setting up the mixer, a tiny fraction of a Bitcoin sent back and forth between your wallets to verify that the code was working. After that, nothing. Silence. The address had sat there, unspent, untouched, invisible to anyone who did not know to look for it. Until tonight. Until the 1.618 Bitcoin arrived. But as you traced the transaction more carefully, as you followed its path through the blockchain's immutable record, you discovered something that made your blood run cold. The transaction had not come from an external wallet. It had not been broadcast to the network from some distant computer, signed with a private key held by a stranger. It had originated from within your own system. From the mixer itself. The transaction had been generated internally, a fragment of code embedded deep in the mixer's architecture, a subroutine you had written and did not recognize, which had activated tonight and sent the 1.618 Bitcoin from your old wallet, through the mixer's own shuffling algorithm, and back to you. Someone had planted a hidden function in your code. Someone had modified the mixer without your knowledge. And that someone was not a stranger. They had access to your old wallet's private key. They knew the architecture of your system well enough to hide a subroutine so deep that you had never found it. They had been inside your machine for years, waiting. And tonight, they had chosen to reveal themselves. You leaned back in your chair and rubbed your eyes. The rain had softened now, its rhythm gentler, more intermittent. The forest was very still. The only sound in the cabin was the soft hum of the server and the occasional creak of the old wood settling around you. The screen continued to glow, the transaction log still open, the 1.618 Bitcoin still sitting in its new wallet, waiting. That number. 1.618, the golden ratio. Phi. It was not random. You had known that from the moment you saw it. But now, as you sat in the cold, dark cabin, the pieces began to fit together in a way that made your chest tighten. The golden ratio had been the foundation of an old encryption protocol, a protocol you had helped develop years ago, in another life, before the cabin, before the forest, before the solitude. The project had been called PhiCrypt. It was open source, a labor of love, built by a small team of 3 people who believed that mathematics could make the world more free. The team had disbanded years ago. The project had been abandoned. But the constant had remained, 1.618, phi, the golden ratio, the number that had been the key to the entire protocol. And only 3 people in the world knew the significance of that number to PhiCrypt. You were one of them. The other 2 had vanished from your life long ago. One of them was your partner. The man who had helped you build the mixer. The man who had left one night and never come back. And now, someone who knew the constant, who knew the protocol, who knew your old wallet and your old code, was reaching out to you through the very machine you had built together. The message was not just in the words. It was in the number itself. 1.618, phi. The key to everything. And the question that now pressed against your mind, quiet but insistent, was this: if your partner was alive, if he was the one sending this message, then why had he waited 3 years? And what was he trying to tell you now? The revelation about the old wallet changed everything. It was one thing to receive a strange message from an unknown sender, that could be dismissed, explained away, attributed to a random anomaly in the blockchain's infinite sea of transactions. But to discover that the message had originated from within your own system, from a hidden subroutine buried deep in the mixer's code, was something else entirely. Someone had been inside your machine. Someone had modified your code without your knowledge. And that someone had been waiting, patiently, for years. You began with the firewall. The first line of defense. It was a custom setup, configured by your own hands, its rules written to allow only the specific ports and protocols that the mixer needed to operate. You pulled up the logs and scrolled through them, line by line, looking for anything out of place. An unauthorized connection. A port opened without your knowledge. A packet from an unknown IP address. But the logs were clean. Immaculate. Every connection was authorized, every packet accounted for. The firewall had not been breached. The intruder had not come from outside. Next, you checked the server's access logs. Who had logged in, and when? The list was short. There were only 2 users on this machine, you and the system itself. You scrolled through the entries, checking each timestamp against your memory. Every login matched. Every session was yours. There were no unexplained entries, no logins at strange hours, no traces of a remote connection from an IP address you did not recognize. The intruder had not logged in. They had not needed to. They had been here all along, hiding in the code itself. The rain had picked up again, drumming harder on the tin roof, a steady, insistent rhythm that seemed to urge you onward. The cabin creaked softly as the wind pushed against its wooden walls. You pulled your chair closer to the desk and began to search the mixer's source code. This was your territory. This was the sea. Ode you had written, line by line, over countless nights just like this one. You knew every function, every variable, every comment. Or so you had thought. You found it in the 3rd hour of your search. It was buried deep in one of the mixer's core modules, tucked behind a line of slashes and asterisks, the marks that programmers use to write comments, notes to themselves that the machine ignores. The comment itself was innocuous / reserved for future optimization. But there was more code beneath the comment. Code that had been hidden there, disguised as part of the annotation. You almost scrolled past it without noticing. But something made you pause, a slight irregularity in the indentation, a line that extended just a little too far to the right. You expanded the comment. And there it was. A subroutine. A small, elegant piece of code that you had never written. It was a self-destruct protocol. It was designed to activate only when it received a very specific signal, a particular string of characters, sent from a particular wallet address, at a particular time. When activated, it would wipe the mixer's memory, erase the transaction logs, and shut down the server permanently. It had been sitting here, dormant, waiting, for 2 years. The subroutine was signed with a digital signature. Not a name. Programmers do not sign their work with names. They sign with cryptographic keys, unique strings of data that prove, beyond any doubt, the identity of the author. You recognized this signature. You had seen it before, years ago, in another code base, on another project. It belonged to your partner. The man who had helped you build the mixer. The man who had left one night and never come back. If your eyes are growing heavy, if the rhythm of the rain is beginning to blur the edges of the screen, then let them. The server is still running. The fan is still humming. The rain is still tapping on the roof above you. The cabin is safe. You can rest now. The code will still be here when you wake. Your partner had left this subroutine behind. He had hidden it in the code, like a message in a bottle, waiting for you to find it. And he had signed it with his key, knowing that someday, somehow, you would see it and understand. He was alive. He had been alive all along. And he was trying to tell you something. The question was, what? And why had he chosen to hide it here, in the deepest part of the machine you had built together? What was the signal that would trigger the self-destruct? And who was he protecting you from? The digital signature on the hidden subroutine was unmistakable. You had verified it 3 times, running it through every cryptographic check you knew, and the result was always the same. The code had been written by your partner. The man who had helped you build the mixer. The man who had shared this cabin with you for nearly 2 years, sleeping in the narrow bunk against the far wall, brewing coffee at odd hours of the night, filling the small space with his restless energy and his unshakable conviction that the world could be changed with enough lines of clean, elegant code. The man who had left one night 3 years ago and never come back. You had not thought about him in a long time. Not because you had forgotten him, you could never forget him, but because the memory was too heavy to carry. It was easier to bury it, to file it away in the same locked drawer where you kept all the other things you could not bear to look at. The things that hurt too much to remember. But tonight, the drawer had been pried open. And now, sitting in the cold cabin with the rain drumming on the roof and the server humming in the corner, you let yourself remember. He was younger than you. Not by much, 5 years, maybe 6, but enough that he still had the bright, untempered idealism of someone who had not yet been disappointed by the world. He believed in things. He believed in the power of mathematics to create justice. He believed in the ability of code to level the playing field between the powerful and the powerless. He believed in the promise of cryptocurrency to overthrow the corrupt institutions that had ruled the global economy for centuries, replacing them with something fairer, something more transparent, something that could not be manipulated by the wealthy and the connected. He spoke about these things with a passion that was almost childlike in its purity. His eyes would light up when he talked about the future he was helping to build, one line of code at a time. And you, older and more cynical, had found yourself drawn to that passion despite yourself. He reminded you of who you had once been, before the years had worn you down, before the compromises and the disappointments and the slow, grinding erosion of hope. You had met online, in a forum dedicated to cryptographic privacy. It was a small, obscure corner of the internet, frequented by a handful of dedicated programmers and activists who shared a common belief, that privacy was a fundamental human right, and that code was the tool to defend it. He had posted a rough prototype of a mixing algorithm, crude, inefficient, full of holes, and you had pointed out 3 critical flaws in his implementation. You had not been kind about it. You had been blunt, almost harsh, the way programmers often are when they see bad code. But he had not been offended. He had been grateful. He had sent you a private message, thanking you for your feedback, asking if you would be willing to look at his revised version. And from that small exchange, a partnership had grown. You began working together. First remotely, through encrypted emails and late-night chat sessions. Then, eventually, he came to live with you in the cabin. It was his idea. He wanted to be close to the work, to breathe the same air as the servers, to build the mixer with his own hands. You had been reluctant at first. You had grown accustomed to your solitude, to the quiet rhythm of your days. But he had worn you down with his enthusiasm, and eventually, you had agreed. He arrived on a gray afternoon in October, carrying a single duffel bag and a laptop case, and for the next 2 years, the cabin felt less empty than it had in a very long time. You worked together in the small room, your desks pushed against opposite walls, your screens glowing into the early hours of the morning. You wrote code. You debated architecture. You tested and retested and refined. And in the moments between the work, you talked about the world, about the future, about the strange and winding paths that had brought you both to this cabin in the middle of the forest. Then came the winter night when everything changed. He had received a message from someone he called an investor. A wealthy backer who was interested in scaling up the mixer, turning it from a small, anonymous service into something much larger, a platform that could serve thousands of users, that could bring the promise of financial privacy to people all over the world. You had been skeptical. You had always been skeptical of outsiders, of people who claimed to share your vision but whose motives were unknown. But he had been excited. He believed this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. He packed a small bag, promised to be back by morning, and drove off into the dark. You stood at the door and watched the taillights of his truck disappear into the rain. The last thing he said to you was that you worried too much. Then the door closed, and the sound of his engine faded into the forest. You never saw him again. You reported him missing. The police did what they could, which was not much. There were no witnesses. No leads. No traces. His truck was found a week later, abandoned in a parking lot near the bus station in the nearest town. The keys were still in the ignition. His wallet was on the passenger seat. But he was gone. The investigation went cold after a few months, and eventually, the case was filed away as another unsolved disappearance. But you never believed he was dead. Some part of you, the part that had known him, that had seen the fierce determination in his eyes, refused to accept that he could simply vanish. Now, 3 years later, his digital signature had appeared in the deepest part of your code. He had left it there, hidden behind a comment in a subroutine you had never thought to examine. And you knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that he was alive. He had been alive all along. He was trying to tell you something. You pulled out an old external hard drive from the drawer beneath your desk. It was a backup of his files, made just before he disappeared. You had kept it all these years, unable to bring yourself to delete it, unable to look at it. Now, you plugged it in. The drive word to life. You began to search through the directories, old code, drafts of the mixer, notes on cryptography. And then you found it. A single file, encrypted, protected by a passphrase. The password hint was simple: why I left. You tried every password you could think of. His birthday. His mother's name. The name of his first dog. The name of the encryption protocol you had built together. Nothing worked. You sat back in frustration, staring at the password hint on the screen. Why I left. And then you noticed something you had not seen before. The word "left" in the password hint was not written in English. It was written in Italian. "Perch me in e sono andato." Not left. Departed. Went away. You remembered the old film you had watched together one night, on the cabin's small television. It was an Italian movie, black and white, about a lighthouse keeper and his wife. The lighthouse keeper had a secret: he was using the lighthouse beam to send coded messages to ships offshore, helping refugees cross the border. In the final scene, before he disappeared, he told his wife, "If you ever need to find me, go to the lighthouse." The title of the film was the password. You typed it in, your fingers trembling slightly, and pressed enter. The diary opened. And there, on the first page, was the beginning of a story you had waited 3 years to read. The diary opened like a door that had been sealed for years. The first entry was dated 3 years ago, just weeks before your partner disappeared into the winter night. The words on the screen were his. You recognized the cadence immediately, the way he capitalized certain technical terms, the small, self-deprecating asides to himself that he had always been in the habit of writing. He had kept this diary in the same way he wrote code, methodically, honestly, with an almost painful clarity of thought. Reading his words now, in the cold cabin with the rain drumming on the tin roof and the server humming its quiet, steady note in the corner, felt like hearing his voice again after a very long silence. He wrote about the investor. The one he had gone to meet on that winter night 3 years ago. He had been so excited, you remembered. He had believed, with the unshakable optimism that you had always admired and envied in equal measure, that this was the moment everything would change. The mixer would grow. Your work would reach more people. The vision you had shared, of a world where ordinary individuals could move their money freely, privately, beyond the reach of governments and corporations, would finally be realized. But the investor, he soon discovered, was not an investor at all. It was a front. A carefully constructed facade, built by a representative of an international financial crime syndicate. This was not a loose network of hackers or a small-time money laundering operation. This was a vast, shadowy organization that moved billions of dollars through the global economy every year, using every tool of modern finance to hide its tracks. They operated in the spaces between jurisdictions, in the gray areas where laws did not reach and enforcement could not follow. They had entire teams dedicated to finding new technologies to exploit, and they had found the mixer. They had been watching it for months. They had analyzed its code, mapped its traffic, studied its vulnerabilities. And they had seen its potential. Not as a tool for privacy or freedom, but as a weapon. A way to clean money on a scale that would make everything else they had ever done look like pocket change. Your partner wrote about the moment he realized the truth. He had been sitting in a hotel room, waiting for the investor to arrive. But instead of a single backer, 3 men had walked through the door. They were not what he had expected. They were not the rough-edged criminals he had imagined when he thought of money launderers. They were professionals. Suits. Lawyers and accountants and strategists who spoke about the mixer in the cold, clinical language of business optimization. They knew everything about it, its throughput, its security features, its weaknesses. And they made it clear, with a calm, almost courteous precision, that he had no choice. He would work for them, or they would destroy everything he had built. The mixer. The cabin. And you. He did not tell you. He wrote that he had wanted to, had stood at the door of the cabin, his bag packed, the words forming in his throat, but he could not bring himself to say them. Because he knew you. He knew that if he told you the truth, you would try to fight. You would try to protect him, and in doing so, you would put yourself directly in the path of people who had no qualms about removing obstacles. People who had made it clear, in quiet, matter-of-fact tones, that they had done it before and would do it again. So he made a choice. The hardest choice he had ever made. He would go with them. He would cooperate, at least on the surface. And he would make sure, by his absence, that they never had a reason to come looking for you. The diary entries grew shorter as the weeks passed. He wrote about the work he was doing for them, the compromises he had to make, the lines he had to cross. He built them a separate version of the mixer, isolated from the original, with back doors that only they could access. He did his best to limit the damage, to slow them down, to build in subtle flaws that would make the system less efficient than it could have been. But he could only do so much. They were watching him constantly. His communications were monitored. His movements were tracked. He was not a prisoner, exactly. He was allowed to move around, to live a semblance of a normal life, but he was never free. There was always someone watching. Always someone listening. He had traded his freedom for your safety, and he had been paying the price every day since. He wrote about the loneliness. The isolation. The weight of carrying a secret that he could never share with anyone. He wrote about the small things he missed, the smell of coffee brewing in the cabin kitchen, the sound of rain on the roof, the way the server's lights blinked in the dark like tiny stars. He wrote about the conversations you used to have, late at night, about code and philosophy and the future of the world. He wrote about missing you. And then, for a very long time, there were no entries at all. The silence in the diary stretched for nearly 2 years. You scrolled through the empty pages, feeling the weight of those missing months. What had he been doing during that time? What had he been forced to do? The diary did not say. Perhaps he had been unable to write. Perhaps the risk had been too great. Or perhaps he had simply run out of words. And then, at the very end of the file, you found the final entry. It was dated last month. Just a few weeks ago. The handwriting was different now, shakier, more hurried, as if he had written it in a moment of rare, fleeting freedom. The words were brief, just a few lines, but they carried a weight that made your chest tighten. They're still watching me. But something has changed. 1.618 has arrived. I don't know how, I don't know who triggered it, but the signal I left in the mixer 2 years ago has finally been activated. The lighthouse is lit. I don't know if you're the one who found it, or if it was someone else. But if you're reading this, if you've followed the trail this far, then you know I'm still alive. And I can come home soon. I just need you to do one more thing. Follow the signal. All the way to the end. I'll be waiting there. You stared at the words. 1.618, the golden ratio. The number from the mysterious transaction that had appeared in your mixer tonight. It was not random. It had never been random. It was a signal. A beacon. A lighthouse in the digital dark. Your partner had left it there, hidden in the code, waiting for you, or someone, to find it. And you had found it. The lighthouse was lit. And somewhere out there, beyond the forest and the mountains and the long, winding road to the coast, your partner was waiting for you to follow the light. The diary entry sat on the screen, its words still glowing in the pale blue light of the monitor. 1.618 has arrived. The lighthouse is lit. I can come home soon. Your partner was alive. He had been alive all along, hiding in the shadows of a world you had tried to forget, waiting for the right moment to reach out across the void. And now, somehow, he had sent a signal through the very machine you had built together, a signal embedded in the golden ratio, in the number that had been the foundation of your shared work. But the signal was not just the 1.618 Bitcoin itself. That was the key. The key to something larger. Something he had hidden deeper. Something that would require all your skill to find. You turned back to the mixer's transaction logs. The 1.618 Bitcoin had been processed, broken into fragments, scattered across the network like a handful of thrown sand. But you had not yet traced where it had gone after it passed through the mixer. Every transaction that entered your system eventually emerged on the other side, clean and anonymous, sent to a destination address specified by the client. That address was usually a wallet, a place where the funds would sit in digital silence until the client chose to spend them, move them, or let them gather the dust of the blockchain. But as you followed the trail of the 1.618 Bitcoin through the layers of the mixer, tracing each fragment as it wound its way through the labyrinth of intermediate wallets, you discovered that its destination was different. It was not a wallet. It was not an exchange. It was an encrypted message service, a digital dead drop, the kind used by intelligence agencies and whistleblowers and people who needed to communicate without leaving any trace in the physical world. The funds had been converted into a ciphertext, a scrambled message encoded in the very structure of the transaction itself. The message could only be decrypted with a specific key, a passphrase, a number, a string of characters that only the intended recipient would know. And the key, you realized with a quiet certainty that settled over you like the sound of the rain, must be hidden somewhere in the mixer's own transaction history. Your partner had left you a trail of breadcrumbs, and it was up to you to follow it. He had known that only you would think to look here, in the machine you had built together, in the code you both knew by heart. You began to search. The mixer processed hundreds of transactions every month, thousands every year, a ceaseless flow of anonymous coins moving through the digital dark. But you were not looking for ordinary transactions. You were not looking for the large transfers or the suspicious patterns or the addresses flagged by automated systems. You were looking for anomalies. Patterns. The small, quiet signals that your partner would have known only you could find, the kind of signals that would be invisible to anyone else, buried in the noise like a whisper in a crowded room. The hours passed unnoticed. The rain continued its steady drumming on the tin roof, a sound so constant that it had become a kind of silence. The server hummed in the corner, its lights blinking in their familiar patterns, green for power, amber for disk activity, blue for network traffic. The fire in the wood stove had gone out entirely, and the cabin had grown cold, the chill seeping through the rough wooden walls. You pulled a blanket over your shoulders and kept searching. And then, scrolling through the logs from the past 2 years, you saw it. A series of tiny transactions. They were so small that they were almost invisible, fractions of a fraction of a Bitcoin, amounts so negligible that no one would ever notice them unless they were looking for them. But they were there. And they were all the same amount. 0.00001618 Bitcoin. The golden ratio, reduced to a microscopic scale, repeated over and over again like a heartbeat in the depths of the blockchain. You leaned closer to the screen. Each of these tiny transactions had been sent on a specific day. They were spaced months apart, always on the first of the month, always at the same hour, midnight, UTC, the universal time of the digital world. And each one was accompanied by a single character in its memo field. A letter. Or a number. Or a symbol. They were scattered across the logs like seeds planted in a field, waiting to be harvested. You collect. Them all, copying each character into a text file on your desktop. There were 20 of them in total, spanning nearly 2 years. You assembled them in order, arranging them by date, and watched as they formed a string of coordinates. Latitude and longitude. A location on the surface of the earth. Your hands were steady now. The rain outside had softened, its rhythm gentler, more intermittent. A single drop fell from the eaves and struck the metal flashing with a small, clear note. You opened a map on your screen, your fingers moving across the keyboard with the same careful deliberation you had brought to every step of this search. You typed in the coordinates. The map zoomed in, scrolling past cities and forests and rivers, past highways and towns and stretches of empty coastline. It settled on a single point on the northern coast, where the land met the sea in a jagged line of rocky cliffs and dark water. A lighthouse. Not a metaphor. Not a symbol from an old film. A real lighthouse, standing on a rocky promontory overlooking the gray, restless water. According to the map, it had been decommissioned decades ago, abandoned by the Coast Guard, left to the wind and the salt and the patient erosion of the sea. It had been dark for half a century. But your partner's coordinates pointed to it with unerring precision. He had hidden this location in the code, buried it in the transaction logs, scattered it across 2 years of fractional Bitcoin payments that no one else would ever have noticed. He had been waiting for you to find it. And now, At last, you had. You sat back in your chair. The server hummed its quiet, steady note. The rain tapped gently on the roof above you. The coordinates glowed on the screen, 38 digits that pointed to a lighthouse on the edge of the world. You did not know what you would find there. You did not know if your partner would be there, or if he would leave you another clue, another signal, another step in the long journey he had laid out for you. But you knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that you would go. You would drive north through the forest, following the roads that led to the coast. You would find the lighthouse, standing alone on its rocky promontory. And you would learn the truth that your partner had been waiting 3 years to tell you. The drive north took longer than you expected. The roads grew narrower as you left the forest behind, winding through coastal hills and stretches of gray rock that rose out of the mist like the bones of some ancient, buried creature. The rain had followed you all the way from the cabin, a steady, patient companion that streaked the windshield and blurred the edges of the world outside. The wipers kept their slow, rhythmic time, thump, 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 a sound that had become as familiar as your own heartbeat. You had not slept since you found the coordinates. Your eyes ached, and your hands were stiff from gripping the steering wheel, but you did not stop. You could not stop. Somewhere ahead of you, at the edge of the continent, the lighthouse was waiting. The GPS lost signal twice. The roads were old, poorly mapped, and the coastal fog had begun to roll in from the sea, thick and gray, swallowing the landscape in slow, silent waves. You drove through small fishing towns that seemed half abandoned, their harbors empty, their storefronts dark, their piers weathered and sagging into the water. A single light burned in the window of a bait shop, but the door was closed, and there was no one to ask for directions. The road narrowed further, becoming a single lane of cracked asphalt that wound along the cliffs, the ocean a gray, restless presence to your left, its waves crashing against the rocks far below with a low, continuous roar that you could feel as much as hear. The wind had picked up now, and you could hear it howling through the gaps in the rocks, a low, mournful sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The rain grew heavier as you drove, drumming on the roof of the car with an insistent, urgent rhythm. The sky had darkened to a deep, bruised purple, though it was still only late afternoon. The storm was moving in fast, the clouds rolling over the sea like a curtain being drawn across the world. You turned on the headlights, and their beams cut through the fog in pale, shimmering tunnels. And then, around a bend in the road, you saw it. The lighthouse. It stood on a rocky promontory jutting out into the sea, a thin stone tower rising against the gray sky like a finger pointing toward the clouds. It was old, far older than the abandoned Coast Guard stations you had passed on the way, older than the fishing towns, older than the roads themselves. Its white paint had faded to a pale, weather-beaten gray, and rust streaked down from the iron railing that circled a lantern room at the top, staining the stone like tears. The door at its base was wrapped with a heavy chain, its links thick and rusted. But the chain was held by a padlock, and the padlock was new. Its surface was clean, its metal still gleaming dully in the gray light. Someone had been here. Someone had secured this door, not to keep people out, but to keep something in, to protect whatever waited at the top of the tower. You stepped out of the car. The wind hit you immediately, cold and sharp, carrying the smell of salt and rain and the distant, mineral scent of wet stone. The ground beneath your feet was uneven, a mix of gravel and bare rock, and the rain had made it slick and treacherous. You pulled your coat tighter around your shoulders and walked toward the door. The lighthouse loomed above you, silent and patient, as if it had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. You knelt before the lock. It was a digital padlock, the kind that required a code instead of a key, a small, battery-operated device that seemed out of place against the ancient, weathered stone. You stared at it for a moment, and then, without quite knowing why, without any conscious decision, your fingers found the keypad and entered the administrator password for the mixer. The same password you had used 1,000 times, in the safety of your cabin, to access the machine you had built with your own hands. The lock clicked open with a soft, precise sound that was almost swallowed by the wind. The chain fell away, clanking against the stone steps. The door swung inward with a low, reluctant groan, as if it had not been opened in a very long time but had been expecting this moment nonetheless. Inside, the lighthouse was dark and cold. The air was still and heavy, smelling of damp stone and rust and something else, something faint and sweet, like old coffee, like the ghost of a human presence. The only light came from the doorway behind you, casting a pale rectangle on the stone floor. A spiral staircase wound upward around the central column, its iron steps bolted into the stone, its railing rusted and loose in places. Dust lay thick on every surface, a soft gray blanket that had been undisturbed for decades. But in the center of the steps, where countless feet had walked, a narrow path had been worn clean, a trail of use that cut through the dust like a path through snow. It had not been made by ghosts or our memories or the slow erosion of time. It had been made by a living person, climbing these stairs, over and over, in the days and weeks and months before you arrived. You began to climb. The wind howled around the tower, whistling through the cracks in the stonework. The rain lashed against the narrow slit windows, and occasionally, a gust of cold, salty air would sweep through the stairwell, making the dust swirl in small, ghostly eddies. Your footsteps echoed on the iron steps, a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to mark the passage of time in a place that had forgotten it. The climb was longer than you expected. The staircase seemed to go on forever, spiraling upward into the darkness above. And then, at the top, you found a heavy wooden trapdoor set into the ceiling. You pushed it open with some effort, the wood swollen with moisture, and emerged into the lantern room. The great Fresnel lens stood in the center of the room, a massive construction of brass and glass, its fittings tarnished to a soft, green patina, its crystal faces cracked and clouded with age. It had not been lit in half a century. Around it, the circular room was lined with windows, most of them streaked with salt spray and grime, some of them cracked or missing entirely, letting the wind and the rain and the cold sea air pour in from outside. The view through those windows was breathtaking, the gray, churning ocean stretching out to the horizon, the waves breaking against the rocks far below, the storm clouds rolling in from the west. But it was not the view that held your attention. It was the small, careful signs of human habitation. A sleeping bag, rolled neatly in the corner, its fabric worn but clean. A small camp stove, with a pot of cold coffee still sitting on its burner. A bag of dried food, sealed against the damp. And a laptop computer, its screen dark, its lid closed, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust, except for the keyboard, where the dust had been worn away by the touch of fingers. Tucked into the edge of the screen frame was a photograph. You recognized it immediately. It was the same photograph you had kept in your cabin for years, the one of you and your partner, standing in front of the mixer's server rack, his arms slung around your shoulders, both of you grinning like fools. The colors had faded, and the edges were curled, but the smiles were still there. Still bright. Still alive. Let this lighthouse settle quietly in your mind now. It has stood on this cliff for half a century, through storms and fog and the slow erosion of the sea. It will not fall tonight. The wind will die down. The waves will calm. Close your eyes, and let the sound of rain on the cabin roof carry you for a while. You opened the laptop. The screen flickered to life, pale and blue in the dim light of the lantern room. The battery was low, a small, red icon blinked in the corner, but there was enough power for what you needed to see. On the screen, open and unsent, was an encrypted email. The recipient address was your own, the mixer's operational mailbox, the one you checked every morning and every night. The subject line was blank. And the body of the message, written in the same careful, deliberate hand that had filled the diary entries, was a single sentence. If you're reading this, then the 1.618 signal worked. Don't come looking for me. I'm protecting you. You read the words twice. 3 times. The wind howled outside. The waves crashed against the rocks below. The laptop screen cast its pale glow across your face, illuminating the dust on the floor, the cracks in the glass, the photograph tucked into the screen frame. Your partner had been here. He had climbed these stairs, slept on this floor, written this message. And he had left it behind, knowing, hoping, perhaps, that someday you would find it. He was alive. He was out there. And he was asking you to let him go. But you knew, with a certainty that went deeper than words, that you could not. Not yet. Not until you understood the full story. Not until you had followed this trail to its very end. The wind howled around the lantern room as you stared at the message on the laptop screen. Don't come looking for me. I'm protecting you. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. Your partner had left this message for you, knowing, hoping, perhaps, that someday you would find it. He had climbed these stairs, slept on this cold stone floor, and typed these words with his own hands. He had been here, in this room, alone with the wind and the sea and the great dark lens that had not cast a beam in half a century. And now, sitting in the same room where he had sat, breathing the same cold, salt-laced air, you wanted nothing more than to answer him. To tell him that you understood. To tell him that you were not afraid. To tell him to come home. Your fingers found the keyboard. It was an old machine, its keys worn smooth from years of use, its trackpad scarred and dulled. You typed a reply, just a few lines, nothing elaborate, nothing that would put him at greater risk if it were intercepted. I'm here. I found the lighthouse. I found the diary. I'm not afraid. Tell me what to do next. You pressed send. The laptop hummed for a moment, its processor whirring softly in the quiet room. The screen flickered once, twice, and then a small notification appeared in the corner: delivery failed. Connection refused. You tried again. The same result. And again. Nothing. The server was rejecting all incoming traffic. Your partner had set up a one-way channel, a digital dead drop that could send messages out into the world, but could not receive anything in return. He was talking to you, but you could not talk back. You could only listen. He was still protecting you, even now, even from a distance. He was making sure that no one could trace your reply back to you. The frustration of it was almost physical, a tightness in your chest, a tension in your jaw. But beneath the frustration was something else. Something warmer. He had thought of everything. He had known that you would come here, known that you would try to reach him, known that you would need to be protected from yourself. You sat back on the cold stone floor, the laptop open on your knees. The rain had softened to a fine mist outside, barely audible against the thick glass of the lantern room windows. The great Fresnel lens stood silent and dark in the center of the room, its brass fittings glinting faintly in the pale glow of the screen. The storm was passing, and through the cracks in the window frames, you could smell the clean, sharp scent of the sea. The waves crashed against the rocks far below, a low, steady rhythm that seemed to mark the passage of time in a place that had forgotten it. You were alone at the edge of the world, with nothing but the wind and the water and the ghost of your partner's words. But you were not ready to leave. There was more here. There had to be. He would not have led you all this way just to show you a single message. He would have left you more. You began to search through the laptop's local files. The directory structure was familiar. Your partner had always been organized, almost obsessively so, naming every folder with a clear, descriptive title that left no ambiguity about its contents. There were directories for source code, for server logs, for the mixer's operational history stretching back years. You recognized some of these files. You had written many of them yourself, sitting beside him at the cabin, the rain drumming on the roof above your heads. Others were newer, created after he left, documenting the work he had done in captivity. And then, tucked away at the very bottom of the file tree, its name unremarkable, its icon identical to a dozen other folders, was a directory you had not seen before. It was named simply, Evidence. You opened it. The folder contained a collection of documents, spreadsheets, and encrypted messages. There were dozens of files, each one meticulously organized and labeled. Your partner had been busy during his years in the shadows. He had not been passively waiting for rescue. He had been gathering intelligence. He had been building a case. The documents were devastating in their detail. Account numbers for shell companies registered in offshore havens. Transaction chains that traced the flow of illicit funds through a labyrinth of banks and exchanges. Names, real names, of the people who ran the operation, the lawyers and accountants and strategists who had turned the mixer into a tool for laundering money on a global scale. There were internal memos, intercepted emails, recordings of phone calls. Your partner had penetrated the syndicate's communications network and had been quietly siphoning data for 2 years, building a complete blueprint of their operation. He had gathered enough evidence to bring down the entire organization. But he had not released it. He had been waiting. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for you. And then, at the very bottom of the folder, AF. Through all the spreadsheets and the encrypted files and the meticulous records of criminal enterprise, you found a document with a different kind of title. It was not a code name or a date or a case number. It was a single word, for her. You opened it. It was a letter. Not an encrypted message, not a coded signal hidden in the memo field of a Bitcoin transaction, but a real letter, written in plain, unguarded prose. The kind of letter that someone writes when they are not sure if they will ever be able to send it. It was addressed to his mother. Her name was written at the top of the page, and below it, the words began to flow. He wrote about his childhood. He wrote about the small house where he had grown up, the garden his mother tended, the roses she planted by the front door every spring. He wrote about the meals she cooked, the songs she sang, the way she had worked 2 jobs to support him after his father left. He wrote about the pride he felt when he got his first programming job, and the guilt he felt when he could not explain to her what he actually did. And then he wrote about the present. He was sorry, he said. He was sorry for the silence. He was sorry for the years of absence. He was sorry for the worry he must have caused. He could not explain where he was or what he was doing, but he wanted her to know that he was thinking of her. That he missed her. That he was doing something important. He was protecting someone. Someone whose life mattered more than his own freedom. The letter was unsigned. It had no date. But tucked into the envelope, folded into a small, neat square, was a piece of paper with an address written on it. A house in a small town, hundreds of miles from here. A place where you could go. A place where someone was waiting. His mother. She was still alive. And she did not know what had become of her son. You folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the pocket of your coat. The rain had stopped entirely now, and through the cracked windows of the lantern room, you could see the first pale light of dawn beginning to seep over the horizon. The storm was over. The sea was calming. And somewhere out there, in the shadows of a world you had tried to forget, your partner was waiting for you to finish what he had started. You did not know how long it would take. You did not know what dangers still lay ahead. But you knew, with a quiet certainty that settled over you like the sound of the waves, that you would go. You would deliver this letter. You would tell his mother that her son was alive. And then, somehow, you would find a way to bring him home. The town was smaller than you had imagined. It sat in a fold of green hills, far from the highways and the cities, a place where the roads were lined with old oak trees whose branches met overhead like the arches of a cathedral, and the houses had front porches with rocking chairs and wind chimes that sang softly in the breeze. The silence here was different from the silence of the forest around your cabin. That silence had been deep and vast and empty. This silence was gentler. It was the silence of a place where people had lived for generations, where the rhythm of life was slow and steady and uninterrupted by the chaos of the outside world. You had driven all day to get here, following the address on the envelope that had been tucked into your partner's letter. The roads had grown narrower and quieter with every mile, winding through farmland and pasture, through stands of maple and birch that were just beginning to turn gold with the approach of autumn. The rain had stopped somewhere along the way, and the sky had cleared to a pale, watery blue, the first sunlight you had seen in days breaking through the clouds in long, slanting shafts of gold that made the wet grass glitter like a field of jewels. You found the house at the end of a quiet street. It was a small white house with green shutters that had faded to a soft, sea-weathered patina, and a garden full of roses that spilled over the wooden fence in a cascade of pink and red and white. The roses were carefully tended, their petals bright and healthy, their stems pruned with a gardener's patient precision. The air around the front door smelled faintly of their perfume, mingled with the rich, earthy scent of freshly turned soil and the clean, sharp tang of the breeze coming down from the hills. A small stone path led from the gate to the front porch, and on the porch, a single wooden chair sat beside a table with a book and a half-empty cup of tea. You stood on the porch for a long moment, the envelope Kanta. In your partner's letter clutched in your hand. The paper was worn soft from being held, from being read and reread on the long drive here. You did not know what you were going to say. You did not know how to explain to an old woman that her son was alive, that he had been alive all along, and that you were the reason he had stayed away. How could you possibly make her understand the choices he had made, the sacrifices, the years of silence? You had barely begun to understand them yourself. You knocked on the door. The sound was soft, tentative, as if you were afraid of disturbing the peace of this quiet place. But the door opened almost immediately, as if she had been waiting for you, as if she had known you were coming long before your car pulled up to the curb. She was a small woman, smaller than you had expected, her gray hair pulled back into a neat bun that sat at the nape of her neck. Her eyes were pale and clear behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that had slipped slightly down her nose. She wore a simple blue dress with a floral apron over it, the kind of apron that had seen years of use in a kitchen, and her hands, resting on the doorframe, were thin and worn with age, the knuckles slightly swollen, the skin loose over the bones. She looked at you for a long moment, her gaze steady and calm, and then, without any surprise in her voice, without any shock or confusion, she spoke. "You're him," she said. "The one he's been protecting." The words stopped you cold. You did not know what to say. You had prepared a dozen explanations on the drive here, a dozen ways to introduce yourself, to explain why you had come. But she had taken all of them away with a single sentence. She already knew. She had known before you arrived. She had been waiting for you, just as your partner had been waiting. Just as the lighthouse had been waiting. You simply nodded. She stepped aside and let you in. The house was warm and smelled of baking bread and lavender and the faint, pleasant mustiness of old wood. The floors creaked gently beneath your feet as you followed her through the small living room, past shelves lined with books and photographs, past a fireplace where a small fire crackled softly. She led you to a kitchen at the back of the house, where a kettle was just beginning to whistle on the stove. The kitchen was small and cluttered and lived in, a jar of honey on the counter, a basket of eggs near the window, a calendar on the wall marked with appointments in careful handwriting. She poured you both a cup of tea, her movements slow and deliberate, the way people move when they have learned that there is no reason to rush, and then she sat down across from you at the worn wooden table that dominated the center of the room. "He came to see me," she said, her voice quiet but steady. A few months ago. It was the middle of the night. I woke up and he was standing in the kitchen, right where you're sitting now. I thought I was dreaming. He didn't stay long, just an hour, maybe less. He looked tired. Thinner than I remembered. But his eyes were the same. He told me he was sorry he couldn't come home. He told me he was protecting someone. Someone important. She paused, stirring her tea with a small silver spoon, her eyes distant. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. But now I think I do. She stood and walked to a small desk in the corner of the room, tucked beneath a window that looked out onto the garden. From a drawer, she withdrew a photograph. It was the same photograph you had seen in the lighthouse, the one of you and your partner, standing in front of the cabin, his arms slung around your shoulders, both of you grinning like fools. The colors had faded slightly, and the edges were curled, but the smiles were still bright. Still alive. She handed it to you with a gentleness that made your chest tighten. He left this for you, she said. He told me you would come someday. He told me to give it to you when you did. You turned the photograph over. On the back, in his familiar, careful handwriting, was a single line, "When the code is clean, I'll come home." And beneath it, a date. Not a date from the past. Not a memory. A date that had not yet arrived. The 1st of next month. Just a few days from now. There's more, she said. She handed you a small, folded piece of paper, no larger than a postage stamp. Inside was a string of characters, a private server address, encrypted, the kind that could only be accessed once, at a specific time. He said to give this to you too. He said you would know what to do with it. You looked at the date on the photograph. The 1st of next month. And then you looked at the server address in your hand. A meeting place. A rendezvous point. Your partner was not just telling you he was alive. He was telling you when and where to find him. He had left a trail of breadcrumbs across 3 years, the hidden subroutine, the encrypted diary, the signal in the blockchain, the lighthouse, the letter to his mother, and now, at last, he had given you the final piece. The lighthouse had been the first step. The photograph was the map. And the server address was the door. All you had to do was wait for the appointed day. And then you would open it. The drive back to the cabin felt different from the drive out. The storm had passed. The sky was clearing, and the first pale light of dawn was beginning to seep through the trees as you pulled onto the familiar gravel track that led to your door. The forest was quiet now, the rain reduced to a soft, intermittent drip from the branches overhead, each drop catching the morning light like a tiny, fleeting jewel. The birds had begun to sing again, the first tentative notes of a new day, rising from the undergrowth in small, hopeful bursts. The cabin stood just as you had left it, its weathered wooden walls dark with moisture, its tin roof still glistening from the night's rain. The generator hummed out back, a low, steady drone that had become as familiar as your own heartbeat. The server's lights blinked through the window, green and amber, marking the quiet passage of data through the machine you had built. But everything felt different now. You had left this place as a man who ran a crypto mixer, a man who hid in the shadows, who asked no questions, who believed that anonymity was its own form of virtue. You were returning as a man who was about to dismantle everything he had built. You sat in the car for a long moment, your hands resting on the steering wheel, the engine ticking as it cooled. The letter from your partner's mother was folded in the pocket of your coat, its paper worn soft from being read and reread. The photograph was there too, the one of you and your partner, standing in front of the cabin, his arms slung around your shoulders, both of you grinning like fools. And the small, folded piece of paper with the server address was clutched in your palm, its string of characters burning against your skin like a brand. The date on the photograph was just a few days away now. The 1st of next month. The day your partner had chosen, years ago, as the moment when everything would change. You had work to do before then. Important work. The most important work of your life. You built a fire first. The cabin had grown cold in your absence, the chill seeping through the rough wooden walls, settling into the furniture and the floorboards. You fed the stove with split logs from the pile beside the door, arranging them carefully, the way you had done 1,000 times before. The dry wood caught quickly, and the flames crackled and popped, filling the small room with their familiar, comforting glow. The heat spread slowly, pushing back the cold, and you felt your shoulders relax, the tension of the long drive beginning to ease. The smell of wood smoke filled the cabin, mingling with the faint, ever-present scent of pine and damp earth that was the background perfume of your life in the forest. You sat down at your desk. The server hummed in the corner, its lights blinking steadily. The rain began to fall again outside, softer now, a gentle patter on the tin roof that seemed to wrap itself around the silence rather than break it. The sound was soothing, rhythmic, a lullaby that had accompanied countless nights of work in this room. And you began to write. This was not the mixer. Not anymore. The mixer was a tool for hiding money, for obscuring the truth, for making the trail of a transaction so convoluted that no one could follow it. What you needed now was the opposite. You needed a tool for revealing the truth. A tool that could take the evidence your partner had gathered, the account numbers, the transaction chains, the names and addresses and incriminating documents that he had spent 2 years collecting at great personal risk, and send it out into the world, anonymously, untraceably, to the people who could do something about it. You worked through the night. The code flowed from your fingers with a fluidity you had not felt in years. It was as if all the years of building the mixer had been preparation for this moment, as if every line of code you had ever written had been leading you toward this single, essential task. The program took shape on your screen, its architecture elegant and efficient. It was not a mixer. It was a release protocol. A data dissemination engine. When activated, it would take the evidence files, hundreds of pages of documents, spreadsheets, and encrypted communications, and distribute them simultaneously to a pre-programmed list of recipients. Financial regulatory agencies in 12 countries. Investigative journalists who specialized in exposing financial crime. International watchdog organizations with the resources and the authority to act on what they received. The transmissions would be encrypted, anonymized, routed through relays that would make them impossible to trace. Once the protocol began, it could not be stopped. Truth would be out. As you worked, the rain continued its gentle drumming on the roof, and the fire crackled softly in the stove, and the server hummed its quiet, steady note. You paused once to make coffee, the routine of grinding the beans and boiling the water a small comfort, a moment of normalcy in the midst of the most consequential work you had ever done. The coffee was strong and bitter, and it warmed you from the inside, pushing back the fatigue that was beginning to creep into your bones. You had not slept in more than a day. But you could not stop now. The first of the month was approaching, and you had promised yourself, and your partner, that you would be ready. You added the recipients one by one, building the list with care. Each address was verified, each connection secured. And then, at the very end, you added one final recipient. It was not a regulatory agency. Not a journalist. Not a watchdog organization. It was a small white house in a quiet town, with green shutters and a garden full of roses. An old woman who had been waiting 3 years to hear that her son was coming home. When the protocol activated, she would receive a message too. A simple message, just a few lines, delivered anonymously to her email inbox. It would tell her that her son was alive. That he had been protecting someone. That he had done something brave and good. And that he was coming home soon. You did not know if she would believe it. You did not know if she would understand. But you knew, with a quiet certainty that settled over you like the sound of the rain, that she deserved to hear it. You set the activation date. The 1st of next month. Your partner's date. The date on the photograph. The date he had chosen, years ago, as the moment when everything would change. You checked it twice, 3 times, making sure the timing was precise. The protocol would activate at midnight, UTC, the universal time of the digital world. When it did, the evidence would go out. The syndicate would be exposed. And your partner, wherever he was, would know that the code was finally clean. Now you can close your eyes. The code is written. It will run on its own, spreading outward like rain joining a stream joining a river flowing to the sea. There is nothing more you need to do. The rest belongs to time. The rest belongs to the first day of the month. Then you turned off the mixer. It was a simple command. A single line of code, entered into the terminal. But its weight was immense. The server's lights shifted, the steady pulse of the shuffling algorithm slowing, stopping, fading to black. The fan spun down, and the cabin grew quieter than it had been in years. On your screen, the log file recorded its final entry. Protocol deactivated. Lighthouse extinguished. Awaiting return. You sat back in your chair. The fire crackled softly in the stove, its embers pulsing with a soft, orange glow. The rain tapped gently on the roof, a sound so familiar that it had become a kind of silence. The server, for the first time in 3 years, was quiet. And somewhere out there, in the dark, your partner was waiting for the first day of the month. Waiting for the signal. Waiting to come home. The months passed slowly after you shut down the mixer. The cabin felt different without the constant hum of the server in the corner, without the blinking lights and the quiet, rhythmic pulse of data moving through the machine you had built. At first, the silence was unsettling. You had grown so accustomed to the background noise of your work that its absence left a hollow space in your days. But gradually, you began to fill that space with other things. You read books that had been sitting unopened on your shelves for years. You took long walks through the forest, following deer trails down to the creek and back, learning the contours of the land in a way you never had when you were spending all your hours in front of a screen. You taught yourself to bake bread, a skill that required patience and precision, qualities you had in abundance, though you had never applied them to anything but code. And you waited. The evidence had been released, just as you had planned. On the 1st of the month, at midnight UTC, the protocol you had built had activated, sending your partner's meticulously gathered files to regulators and journalists and watchdog organizations around the world. The response had been swift and decisive. Within weeks, arrests had been made. Accounts had been frozen. The syndicate that had held your partner captive for 3 years had been dismantled, its leaders exposed, its infrastructure shattered. You had followed the news from your cabin, reading the reports on your laptop, watching the faces of the men who had threatened your partner's life appear on courtroom sketches and news broadcasts. They were gone now. The danger was over. But still, your partner did not return. You did not know where he was. The server address he had left for you, the one on the folded piece of paper his mother had given you, had gone silent. You had checked it every day since the protocol activated, but there was nothing. No messages. No signals. Just an empty inbox, waiting. You told yourself that he was being careful. That he needed time. That after 3 years in the shadows, emerging into the light was not something that could be done overnight. But still, the waiting was hard. Then, one afternoon in late autumn, the letter arrived. It came in the regular mail, delivered to the P.O. box in the nearest town that you used for supplies. You had driven in to pick up groceries and fuel for the generator, and on a whim, or perhaps not a whim, perhaps something deeper, some quiet intuition you could not name, you had stopped at the post office. The box was mostly empty, the usual assortment of catalogs and bills. But tucked between them was a small, cream-colored envelope, hand-addressed in handwriting you recognized. Your name. The cabin's postal route number. No return address. You stood there in the post office, the envelope trembling slightly in your hands. The postmark was from a town you had never heard of, hundreds of miles away. The stamp was ordinary, a flag and a landscape, the kind you could buy at any post office in the country. But the handwriting was his. You would have known it anywhere. You drove home through the rain, the envelope sitting on the passenger seat beside you, unopened. You wanted to open it in the cabin. You wanted to be sitting at your desk when you read it, with the fire crackling in the stove and the rain drumming on the tin roof and the forest standing silent and dark around you. You wanted to be home. When you finally sat down and slid your thumb beneath the flap of the envelope, the paper came away easily. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. And on that sheet, in the same careful, deliberate handwriting that had filled the diary entries and the encrypted messages and the note on the back of the photograph, was a single line. I'm back. No signature. There was no need for a signature. You would have recognized his handwriting anywhere. You set the letter down on the desk. Your hands were steady. Your breathing was slow. The fire crackled softly in the stove, and the rain drummed gently on the roof, and the forest was quiet and still around you. And then you stood, walked to the door, and stepped out onto the porch. The rain was falling steadily, streaking through the air in silver lines, turning the gravel path to mud and making the pine needles glisten. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke and the faint, clean scent of the forest. And there, far down the muddy road that led to the cabin, barely visible through the veil of rain, was a figure. Walking. Coming toward you. You did not run to meet him. You did not call out. You simply leaned against the doorframe, feeling the rough wood press against your shoulder, and you watched. The figure drew closer, step by step, emerging from the gray curtain of rain. You could see the outline of his shoulders now, the familiar way he walked, head slightly down against the weather, hands in his pockets. He looked thinner than you remembered. His hair was longer. But it was him. It was him. The rain continued to fall, steady and patient, as it had fallen through all the years you had spent in this cabin, through all the nights of work and worry and waiting. And you knew, as you watched him come up the path, that this story did not end with numbers. It did not end with code, or with evidence files, or with courtroom sketches, or with the quiet hum of a server in the corner of a room. It ended here. With rain on a tin roof. With the smell of wet pine needles. With a man, walking home. Good night.